And then you can use like the translation service to it's
Mine, it's working.
yeah. Então, boa tarde a todos, boa tarde. A gente vai dar início à Conferência Internacional de Desastres Globais e Sociedade Mundial. Eu vou ler aqui um trecho que foi a justificativa do nosso projeto para fazer esse evento e fazer os agradecimentos, né? Então, desastres de grande escala têm atuado como um mecanismo de seleção na evolução a longo prazo dos sistemas mundo. As múltiplas dimensões da crise atual envolve a Terra e constitui apelos urgentes, tanto a análise como a ação. Os desastres não são apenas tragédias para os seres humanos, mas também para os ecossistemas e as formas de vida não humanas. E as catástrofes foram importantes, desencadeadoras de mudanças sociais no passado e continuarão sendo no futuro. Na COP27, concluiu-se que a industrialização e o consumo excessivo do norte global têm sido um dos maiores impulsionadores do aquecimento global. O aumento contínuo das temperaturas globais, em comparação aos níveis pré-industriais, não só está gerando mudanças na magnitude e na frequência das ondas de calor, secas, incêndios florestais, inundações e tempestades em todas as regiões da ecologia mundo capitalista, mas também está causando a extinção de espécies, o desgelo das calotas polares e a elevação do nível do mar. As alterações climáticas ameaçam os humanos e não humanos, e a sobrevivência do biossistema global que os humanos conhecem. Estas consequências são mais destrutivas no sul global. Este desafio civilizacional requer investigação transdisciplinar, básica e aplicada para estudar desastres naturais e antropogênicos e os casos em que diferentes tipos de desastres ocorrem em conjunto a nível global, nacional e local. A Conferência sobre Desastres Globais e Sociedade Mundial proporcionará, nesses 3 dias, uma oportunidade para especialistas, acadêmicos, líderes políticos, ativistas de movimentos sociais, se concentrarem em debaterem as causas, consequências e ações necessárias que precisam ser tomadas para ajudar a humanidade e o ecossistema a evitar os piores resultados desta crise nos próximos anos. Então, este evento é uma realização do Grupo de Pesquisa em Economia Política do Sistemas Mundo, em parceria com a Rede de Desastres e Resiliência da Universidade da Califórnia. E, para organizar o evento, não teria sido possível sem o apoio de algumas instituições e de pessoas. Eu gostaria de começar agradecendo à Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, o Centro Socioeconômico, o Programa de Pós-Graduações em Relações Internacionais, o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Desastres Naturais, o Instituto para a Pesquisa em Sistemas Mundo da Universidade da Califórnia, a Seção de Economia Política dos Sistemas Mundo da Associação Americana de Sociologia, a Associação de Estudos Globais da América do Norte, a Associação Internacional da Big History, a Fundação de Estudos e Pesquisas Socioeconômicos, e, por fim, um agradecimento especial, muito especial, à World Society Foundation, que está representada pelo professor Christian Schutter, eu acho que ele está presente aqui no Zoom também, que desde a idealização desse evento se disponibilizou a arrecadar os recursos financeiros e que permitiu, então, viabilizar este evento. Então, agradecer a ele muito a paciência de ter que lidar com as burocracias que estavam envolvidas nesse processo. Então, muito obrigado à World Society Foundation. E também agradecer às pessoas que estão me ajudando nessa organização, o nosso grande entusiasta, o professor Christopher Chase-Dunn, os professores Pedro, Elton, a Janete, que eu não sei se já chegou, aqui, do PPGD, a Paola, a Júlia, que desde o começo estão bem ajudando. Aí tem outros, Gabriel, Mariana, Gustavo, o Andrei, muitos outros, tá? Muito obrigado. Sem vocês, a gente não estaria organizando este evento. Então, sem muita demora, eu gostaria de chamar aqui à mesa o professor Pedro Vieira, que coordenará a conferência de abertura do professor Christopher Chase-Dunn.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will talk only in English. For sure, everyone will understand my English, including the Portuguese colleagues. I'm here only to present Professor Christopher Chase-Dunn, who will give us the talk, that will open our seminar. And the title of the talk is Evolution in Disaster, Global and Local Hazards and Disasters in Biological and Socio-Cultural Evolution and Ways Forward in the Current Crisis. I will make a short presentation of Professor Christopher Chase-Dunn. Christopher Chase-Dunn is Distinguished Professor of Graduate Division and Co-Director of the Institute for Research on the Water System at the University of California-Riverside. He received his PhD in Sociology from Stanford University in 1975. Christopher has done cross-national quantitative studies of the effects of the parents on foreign investment, and he studies city and settlement systems in order to explain human sociocultural evolution. His research focuses on interpolitic systems, including both the modern global political economy and early regional world system. Christopher began a research program in world system analysis, studying world system before the modern world system. So he's a pioneer in this studies. Chris is the founder and former editor of the Journal of World System Research and the series co-editor of a book series published by Spring Verde. In 2001, he was elected a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 2002, he was elected president of the Research Committee on Economy and Society of the International Sociological Association. And in 2008, Chris was elected Distinguished Senior Scholar of the International Political Economy session of the International Studies Association. Chris is also an activist in the peace movement and has done research on global left. There are some books about this issue. Chris has written many books. I will read Global Formation and Structures of the World Economy, Core Periphery Relations in Pre-Capitalist Worlds, The Historical Evolution of the International Political Economy, Rise and Demise, Comparing World Systems, the Ubuntu and their neighbors, a very small world system in Northern California, the future of global conflicts, the spiral of capitalism and socialism, globalization on the ground, post-Guatemalan development and democracy, hegemonic declines, present, past, the historical evolution of world system, global social change, a reader, wrote in the book of world system analysis, and social change, globalization from the storage to the present. So for this brief curriculum, you can see that we are in front of very important and productive and influential research and activists. So I desire you, I'm sure we will have a very productive conference. Please, can you begin?
Okay, Pedro, thanks. Shall I start? Can you hear me? Hello, can anybody hear me? Thank you. Okay, yeah, I'm going to give a talk that tries to cover quite a bit of ground. But before I do that, Pedro, Fabio, did you mention the sponsors and co-sponsors of our conference? They did. Okay. Okay. I wanted to make sure that that was done. I want to say one more thing about this conference. It's a global synchronous hybrid conference with local hubs in Riverside and Johannesburg, South Africa, Riverside, Southern California. And this is the way both global and regional conferences should be organized in the future, with local and adjacent attendees attending in person and more distant contributors and attendees using long distance communications technologies. Air transportation is and will be costly with respect to its use of energy and the humans need to power down. So part of what we're dealing with here is the fact that we're in the middle of a environmental crisis in the world, and it would be good if we could figure out how to carry on our conversations at the level that we're doing it here globally without making things worse. So basically, this synchronous and hybrid kind of conference is the kind of conference everybody should be doing, and increasingly professional associations are moving in that direction. I got a couple of things to say. Well, let me just start with my PowerPoint. Can everybody see my first slide here? Is that working? Okay, thank you. The title's a little different from what Pedro said because it's evolved as I've been working on this. So it's evolution of disasters, geological, biological, and socio-cultural evolution, the next three futures, and what is to be done now. Now, many of these topics are ones that are being covered in our conference. And in fact, there's a session on Wednesday on what is to be done now. But this is my version of that. And I've been able to read some of the papers, but not all the papers that are going to be delivered at that session. So I recommend that to everybody. It's at, I believe it's at 2 p.m. on Wednesday, Brazil time. So this is just an overview of what I'm doing here in this talk today. The first thing that I want to do is get you to think about time in a different way. So I'm going to be talking about deep time as a way of thinking about our current problems. And I think there are big advantages to this because basically humans and other life forms on Earth have been facing disasters for a very long time, and we can learn from the past. But the other point is that the current situation is both similar to and in some ways different from, unique regarding the way in which what exists in terms of human institutions and also the global nature of the problems. Things in the past were more local. There were local problems. There were local disasters. There were local collapses. We're in the middle of something that's undeniably global right now, and we need to think about solutions at the global level, but not only at the global level, because we need to mobilize people at all levels in their own households and all the way up. So I'll be addressing when my part about what is to be done, that problem about what to do at different levels of analysis. The big history is a perspective in which the story is told about geological evolution, biological evolution, and socio-cultural evolution. Okay, but what I need to do just very briefly is talk about the word evolution, because this is still a controversial word in social sciences. And there's a reason for that. In the 19th century, social Darwinists used evolutionary thinking as a justification and legitimation for empire and for social class inequalities. And that sort of gave, and the work of Herbert Spencer, who did have a big history view of evolution, was used by, not so much by him, but by others, to legitimate empire and inequalities and exploitation and all this stuff. So there's a way to talk about evolution without thinking of it as progress or as regress. And that's to think of it as pattern changes in complexity and hierarchy that can be observed empirically in what we know about what happened. Okay. You don't have to make any assumptions about whether it was good or bad. You can, and that's fine. But a scientific way of thinking about evolution is don't worry about whether it's progress or not. Just try to see what happened regarded to changes in complexity and hierarchy. And that's the perspective and the idea that I'm using here when talking about evolution. There's another thing that I have to mention. I'm going to be talking about the future in this talk. So we need to understand that human social change, there's no inevitability because there are conjunctures and there's a lot of accidents going on. And so we can't really predict the future in saying, this is what's going to happen. What we need to do is consider possibilities, more than one possibility about what might happen. So we need to talk about multiple futures, multiple probable, but not inevitable futures. And that's what I'll be doing when I get to that point. There's also other issues about evolution. People use it. Teleologists, people who think that there are purposes in the universe, use evolutionary thinking or have, and basically we don't want to do that. What we're interested in about evolution is what are the proximate causes of increases or decreases in complexity and hierarchy. So what I'm studying, both in geology and in biology and in socio-cultural, human socio-cultural evolution, is changes in complexity and hierarchy. So let me get this stuff out of here. Hang on. Geophysical evolution is the Big Bang story. Okay. And it's on television. You all kind of know this story. It's the predominant creation myth of global human culture at this point, because science and the humanities and humanism are the most centrally institutionalized ideologies in global culture. But they contend with a lot of other ideologies, as you're well. There are multiple civilizations that are converging into something that I call global culture. But humanism and science are part of that. They're not something else. They're not religion. They're a type of religion. And I am a scientist and a humanist, I will say. Okay. So when I act as a citizen, I try to use those values. But today I'm talking to you, at least in this part of the lecture, as a scientist. Okay. And I'm a critical sociologist, so I'm trying to be standing on the moon, looking down at the humans and telling you what I see. I'm trying to be objective. Now, I know there are huge challenges to doing that. I'm really not standing on the moon. I'm here in Southern California. I grew up in the United States. I speak English, not Portuguese. My Portuguese is not so good, and the Google Translator thing isn't helping very much. It can't even get the English right, let alone when it tries to translate Portuguese. So I know that I am actually looking at the world from a particular point of view, which is the challenge to objectivity, but I'm trying to overcome that challenge by standard methods that have been developed in social science to try to be objective. We've been working on this for a long time. This is not a new discovery, that there's a lot of subjectivism involved in science, okay? But we have developed a lot of methods to try to be objective. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to look at things from the point of view of the cosmos and say, my little human brain is trying to say what actually happened. And that's what's going on with the Big Bang theory too. What we see is this picture over here in the Big Bang theory. It's the rise of complexity. Basically, there's a beginning point 13 billion years ago, which is a big explosion, and it's a fairly homogeneous cloud of energy and particles that then expand, start cooling, and differentiate into stars and galaxies and the solar system and the stuff that we see when we look around now. Okay. So complexity actually emerges in geophysical evolution in the sense that it goes from homogeneity to complexity. The other thing that happens is the universe gets bigger and starts cooling down. That's different. Okay. When the interesting thing about evolution is you can try to figure out what's the same and what's different from in geophysical, biological, and human socio-cultural evolution, because they're not the same, but they're similar. And, Herbert Spencer figured this out in the 19th century. There's no tool for learning in geophysical evolution. Okay, there's no way in which codes can be preserved and handed off to the future. So the processes are ongoing, but there's no learning mechanism. There's also no rise in hierarchy, okay, which is what's one of the things that's different when we look at biological and sociocultural evolution. There are disasters that stars blow up, and that's part of the evolutionary process, and it affects the geophysical process. Biological evolution, we mainly know it from studying the history of the Earth. We've been looking for life forms from other points because it seems to most people who think about the universe unlikely that life would only emerge in one place. But there really, even though this has been going on for 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years, there really hasn't been much found in terms of the search for extraterrestrial life forms, or at least consciousness and smart life forms. So what we know about biological evolution comes from the study of the Earth, but we know a lot, okay? One thing is complexity emerges. When life gets started, it's really pretty simple, small scale, and not much differentiation, but it increasingly differentiates. And there's a process of living things learning to find free energy and use free energy to build up more complex biological systems. There's something called Elton's pyramid, which is about trophic levels. And it's the emergence of hierarchy in biological evolution. And the insight is big, fierce organisms need a lot of energy. And the way they get it is by eating smaller organisms that have already captured a whole bunch of energy, which is why there aren't that many big, fierce organisms. There are exceptions to this, like whales, but whales suck in a whole lot of very small scale things to get the energy that they need. Most big, large animals are predators or have figured out how to get enough energy to be large. So there's a pyramid, a hierarchy within biology and that emerged in biological evolution. It's about concentrating free energy, which allows for a larger size. One really interesting thing that I've learned quite a bit about is the emergence of social insects. Social insects are fascinating because they develop social complexity. I'm a sociologist, in the absence of much consciousness. And they do that, even though they have ants have very rudimentary nervous systems. Basically, their brain is a kind of wide part in one neuron in their heads. But they were able to, about 30 million years ago, evolve complex social structures, we think, from the evidence that we can find for the existence of ants. We can find old 30 million year old ants that look very similar to ants that exist now. And ants, I'm going to stop talking about ants because I don't have all day here, but the important point here is social complexity can emerge without much in the way of consciousness. Now, ants do have some consciousness compared to earlier life forms, but not much. And to the extent that they have intelligence, it's at the level of the community. Okay, what ants are is parallel processors. And it's the ant community that kind of has a brain, not the individual ants. And they have complexity. They have army ants. They have imperialism. Some ant colonies conquer other ant colonies by substituting their queen for the old queen and getting all the workers to feed their queen and take care of their babies. I mean, this is so cool. It's ant imperialism. All right, I'm shutting down about ants now. The important point here is social structure, complex social structure can emerge without much consciousness. Okay, and that's one of the differences with humans is there's a lot of consciousness keeps evolving itself, and humans have it, and so their social structures are actually even more complicated, because if you're trying to create institutions and structures to regulate the interaction among smart entities, it's a more difficult problem than if they're a bunch of ants are social biologically. They feed each other, okay? And they feed strangers. As long as that you smell like you're a member of the community, they feed each other, okay? Humans do that too, but usually not to strangers. Huh, I thought I cut this slide out. Uh-oh, I may have the wrong. Okay, well, this is just about what the timeline on Earth looks in biological evolution. And I think I maybe put up the long PPT PowerPoint rather than the short one. So I'm just going to keep moving here. Disasters are important in biological evolution, meaning there are big events that happen that change the direction of biological evolution. And geologists have gone through waves of catastrophism. In the 19th century, they thought about geological evolution in terms of catastrophes, and then the idea of equilibrium came to dominate geology. But in the 20th century, some discoveries were made that brought catastrophism back. So the study of the theories of catastrophism and equilibrium interacted with one another to come up with the notion of punctuated equilibrium, and geologists work out models that include both shocks and slow even processes, and both are operating simultaneously. The big discovery that caused the most recent thing about punctuated equilibrium was the discovery of the remains of a crater in the Yucatan in Mexico, which was caused by an event in which a really big asteroid clobbered the Earth and made this huge crater and created a mass extinction. And that mass extinction was very important because it wiped out about 75% of the species and genera that were on the Earth. Because of the nuclear winter, it created this big cloud, and it was really cold for a long period of time, which killed off a lot of organisms. But there was a little furry thing living in the bushes. So now when the Earth finally recovered from the nuclear winter, it was an opportunity for this little furry thing. It was the mammals. It was us, okay? So niches can't be taken over unless they've been vacated. And disasters vacate niches, which is an opportunity for the survivors to take over those niches. There's competition going on among species and stuff for free energy. And free energy can be mainly taken up by the predominant big species, but if they get wiped out, it's an opportunity for little guys that are living in the bushes, little furry things. The other thing to say about geological evolution is biological evolution is probably speeded up because our planet has a high background radiation level because of the molten core, which is full of radiation that keeps spewing out in volcanoes and all that, and keeping a rather high level of background radiation, which causes genetic mutations, which are the source of, which is a Darwinian idea about how evolution occurs. The other thing are supernovas. Stars explode, and sometimes those explosions, if they're somewhat near our solar system, have a big effect on what's going on Earth. And the other thing to mention in connection with disasters is mass extinctions. There have been 5 huge mass extinctions. This one 66 million years ago was just the most recent one, okay? So species keep getting wiped out by disasters, and that changes the course of evolution because new species emerge when that happens. Okay, yeah, I am using my long slide. This is just a picture of the big mass extinctions. And that last one, the end Cretaceous, was the one at the crater in Yucatan. All right, now I'm going to explain to you the main comparative and deep time perspective that I use to study human socio-cultural evolution. And the biological story is the biological evolution of our species, which I'm not really going to talk about very much here. I'm going to talk about sort of after modern Homo sapiens emerged, which is relatively recently, the last 100,000 years, more or less. Okay. And the story is that modern humans emerged in Africa and diffused around, but earlier hominids had already diffused to a lot of places. So they had to outcompete the earlier hominids, which they did. And they didn't get to the Americas till about something less than 20,000 years ago. So the Americas came late in terms of occupation by hominids, or there were no hominids here. So it was modern humans who first came. The big deal that's going on here is the long-term evolution of consciousness, okay? Single-celled animals don't have much in the way of consciousness. But as animals and plants got smarter, the animals developed consciousness. Some people think plants have consciousness, and they do have a kind of consciousness, okay? It's weird. It's not what we think of. What happened with humans was with the evolution of consciousness was first spoken language. Spoken language is an amazing development, which allows people to communicate with each other about what's happening now, and also to pass down learning to their offspring. So this is a change in the way evolution works, because now you have people learning how to do things and passing that along to their offspring and to other people. And you have the diffusion of culture and technology and all this stuff going on, which basically speeds up evolution because it adds a new wrinkle to the way evolution works. It's no longer dependent on genes, on genetic selection and all that stuff, the Darwinian stuff. It's a new kind of evolution, but the Darwinian genetic stuff doesn't go away. So what happens is culture interacts with biology and they co-evolve. Eventually, only about 5,000 years ago, you have the emergence of writing. And writing is a game changer because now it just cheapens communication and makes it easier for a lot of people to have access to, or more people to have access to what has been learned and all this stuff. The big game changer. What's going on is the emergence of global consciousness, okay? And there are a bunch of theorists of this. A lot of them are teleologists, but there's a way to study this from the point of view of evolution where you don't have to assume that consciousness is better than no consciousness. You just observe what happened with consciousness. And of course, a lot going on recently with the internet and all that stuff. These things change the way evolution works. Now, what I have done, Pedro mentioned it, is for the last 25 years or a bit longer, I'm a world system sociologist who studies systems that exist at the level of interpolity relations. So polities are now national states, but if we go back in the past, there were earlier kinds of polities that were simpler, not as large, and so on. So you can use a world system perspective to study what happened before the emergence of the modern world system. And Pedro mentioned that I wrote a book about a world system, a small world system in Northern California, based studying people who basically got wiped out once the Europeans arrived. But before that, they had a world system going that was small, but in some ways similar to the global one that we live in now. So what I do is compare small, medium, and large world systems to one another to see what's similar and what's different, and then to use that to study evolution, how world systems evolve. And the research program that's doing this at the University of California-Riverside, it's called the Settlements and Polities Research Working Group. I've recently become interested in theories of how disasters affect human socio-cultural evolution, but I was already talking about disasters in geophysical and biological evolution. And so I see these things as, in order to know what's different, you need to know what happened before. That's the logic of going back in time, okay? And that logic applies to both the present and the future as well as to the past. But logically, you have to do this, okay? Otherwise, you don't really know what's new. You can say things about what you think is new, but in order to actually have evidence about that, you need to know what happened before. And you need to do empirical research in order to do that. I'm sort of a sociologist, but I've become very interested in archaeology. And it's an archaeological perspective framework that allows me to compare small, medium, and large world systems. Now, granted, most archaeologists study individual polities one at a time as if they're on the moon, but they're not. They're usually all interacting with other polities, at least the ones right around them. What happens is the polities get bigger and the networks of systemically interacting polities get bigger. There's a process of the emergence of complexity and hierarchy within polities and between polities. Core periphery hierarchies. I don't know how many of you are world system people, but I'm going to talk briefly about this because this framework of comparison allows me to see some things that we don't normally think about. The first polities of modern humans are hunter-gatherer bands, and they're nomadic hunter-gatherer bands, and then some of those people settle down and become sedentary. They all have rather small interpolity relations. But what I found by studying some of these is they don't have much in the way of interpolity hierarchy. So they're systemically interacting with other polities, but they're not constructing interpolity hierarchies. At the same time, within them, you have relatively egalitarian structures. Basically, older people have more power than younger people. And sometimes men have a little more power than women, but not usually. Usually the gender relations are pretty equal. And there is nothing like hierarchical lineages or conical clans and all that stuff. Those forms of inequality start to emerge late on in some of these sedentary hunter-gatherer world systems, and then kind of really take off once you have the emergence of chieftains and stuff like that. So what happens actually in human sociocultural evolution is the emergence of hierarchy both within polities and between polities in interpolity systems. So what we call core periphery relations is that second thing, okay? It's institutionalized hierarchy operating between polities, among polities, in the system of polities, right? So complexity and hierarchy emerge both within human, what we call societies. I call them polities because societies are, it's a more complicated idea that doesn't track well when you're trying to talk about self-contained entities. So I use the term polity. By polity, I mean it's a general term that covers hunter-gatherer bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states, empires, and modern national societies. The way in which interpolity relations emerge in empires is through the invention of what Michael Mann called technologies of power, the ability to extract resources from distant peoples. And a lot of this is military, but it's not all military. It also involves the development of economic institutions that allow for trade. And sometimes that trade is equal and sometimes it's unequal. Sometimes it's unequal exchange, sometimes it's equal exchange. But anyway, the point is that as polity get bigger, they need energy and they need labor power and all that stuff. And they develop technologies that allow big ones to extract resources from little ones. There are waves of the rise and fall of empires. I'm going to show you some graphs in a minute, but while I'm still talking about modern core-periphery relations, I want to show you this, which is one of my favorite graphs. This is based on the work of a man named David Hennigy, who studied colonial governors from the Portuguese. Actually, this is the second wave of European colonialism. The first wave is what we call the Crusades, okay? After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe fell apart. It was the Dark Ages. There's small polities. They're interacting with one another. Some of them have memories of what was going on in the Roman Empire, but mostly not much is going on. Then you have the emergence first of city-states and then of states that are larger than city-states. And those states start expanding. And this bottom blue set of blue bumps are waves of European colonialism in terms of the numbers of colonial governors. Okay. What Hennigy did was count the number of colonial governors, beginning with the Portuguese Empire in the 15th century. The first Portuguese colony not in Europe was in Ceuta, right across the Straits of Gibraltar from Portugal. What was going on was a coalition between Genoese finance capitalists and the Portuguese king. And they started, the Portuguese started going around Africa and figuring out an alternative route by which Mediterranean societies could get connected with what was going on in India and in China. They were rewiring the system. And the Portuguese Empire emerged in that context. It was the first modern European colonial empire. Empires themselves are changing the way in which they're organized. Empires before this, many of them, most of them, were about conquering your neighbors and extracting labor and food from the peasants of the people you conquered. Colonial empires actually were developed by maritime societies and capitalist city-states in the Bronze Age, but they weren't the predominant form. In Europe, the big empires, not all of them, but the ones that kept expanding here were colonial empires, meaning establishing political military control over territories a long way away rather than conquering your neighbors. And that the reason that happened was the capitalism was emerging, and the strategy was how to make an empire that serves the interests of profit making rather than tribute extraction. And the Portuguese are, in a way, the first modern example of that. Anyway, the big point here is there's waves of expansion. That's what those bumps are, the blue bumps. Okay, every time the number of colonial governors increases. So European colonialism didn't just rise and then fall. And this is putting all the colonial empires together. Okay, I have another graph, but I don't have time for it, that shows which country did what. The other big point about this cool graph are waves of decolonization. So what happened in world history was the creation of a global polity in which the European interstate system got expanded to the rest of the world, creating a global political system of formerly sovereign nation states, which is what we have now. But that emerged in two big waves. The first big wave was at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. It was basically mainly Latin American decolonization. But that early bump there, that's 1776. 13 colonies in North America told their colonial governors to go home. That was called the American Revolution. Then we had the Haitian Revolution, and then we had Latin American decolonization. That's that big bump there. Then there were some decolonizations, but the big wave came shortly after World War II. Basically, the rest of the world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Latin America was already done, but Asia and Africa decolonized, and that's that second big bump. So there's both colonialism and decolonization are cyclical, basically, okay? This is how we end up with the world of the United Nations and all that. Yeah. Now, the other idea I've got to introduce, and it's actually important for understanding what I just showed you, is the idea of world revolutions, okay? There's a huge literature in studies of collective behavior and social movements in sociology and in political science where we study revolutions. And a lot of people write books about revolutions. And we kind of know what they are, although there's a lot of fighting about what the definitions are. What world revolutions are periods of time in which rebellions and social unrest break out locally all over the system, both in the core and in the non-core, in the semi-periphery and the periphery, okay? And they kind of happen all together, and they're especially at the beginning, they're indirectly linked to each other because of the hierarchical structure of the system. They may not even know about each other because they're on different continents and stuff, but who knows are the home office of the colonial power, okay? And they're the ones who are trying to deal with this, okay? We've got shit breaking out everywhere, and we got to figure out what to do about it. And then we designate these world revolutions by a series of sort of symbolic years in which something big happened in each one of them. The first one was the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, okay? It happened mainly in Europe, but it was a huge uprising that affected the structure of empire and the structure of power in the whole system. 1789, you may recognize as the French Revolution, but it was also the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and that huge wave of decolonization in Latin America. If you look at it from a world system point of view, it wasn't just the French Revolution. The French Revolution was what was going on in France influenced the American Revolution because the French government supported the United States against Britain, but then those ideas spread. There's already a lot of communication going on in the whole system. Those ideas spread, and the king had spent too much money supporting the American Revolution, so the monarchy fell in France. And then those ideas spread to the French colonies like Haiti, and there was Haitian decolonization in 1804, and the Haitians took care of Simon Bolivar when he was basically thrown out of Latin America, okay? He moved to Haiti for a while, and they supported him and supported the decolonization of the Spanish colonial empires, okay? So these things were already all connected, and we need to think about both politics and economics from a world system point of view in order to understand how this works. And then there's a whole bunch more world revolutions, and of course they get tighter and closer together as we go on, and part of that is probably that we know more about it than we know about these earlier centuries, but I don't know. many of us were around for some of these. Okay, 1968 was a big student revolt that occurred in a lot of places, not everywhere, but the connections were already much stronger. It wasn't that things were just happening out in the system and nobody knew about it. There were global communications going on. Okay, I lived in the Bay Area in Northern California. There were Red Guards in San Francisco. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. They were interacting with the Black Panthers. Okay, it was a world revolution. World doesn't mean it happens everywhere. It means it happens in a lot of places, and the powers that be have to deal with it. And what happened is over time is the movements became transnational. They started communicating with each other and supporting one another. So this is a collective behavior phenomenon. And why is it important? Because it's a selection mechanism for hegemony. The elites in the world system are competing with one another. There's states and there are firms and there are historical blocks, and they compete with one another. The ones that handle the world revolutions most effectively, meaning cool them out by adopting some of what they're asking for and ignoring the other stuff, are the ones who become hegemonic. So the rise and fall of global governance by hegemony is actually heavily influenced by these events, these transhistorical, transnational events, these world revolutions. So I'll be mentioning this later because, oh, nice picture. The Bastille. Shut it down. Prison breakouts by the mob. Never heard of anything like that happening? Yeah. So this is what the core periphery hierarchy looks like now. And I used to have to design my own things like this, but you can find this in Google Images. Okay, just search core periphery real hierarchy. And I got this way. It looks pretty accurate to me. The point, the big world system point is the world system is stratified. It's a system of structured inequality, and that thing keeps evolving. The core periphery hierarchy, like all stratification systems, there's a little upward and downward mobility, but the main thing is there's not much change. If I know what your world system position was 50 years ago, the best guess about what it is now is it's the same. There is upward and downward mobility, however. The United States of America went from not in the system before the Europeans got here to, well, it was a set of world systems. It was part of a complex Mesoamerican set of small systems and bigger systems. And then it got incorporated into the modern world system by the Europeans. And then it was a periphery, basically. It was a colonial periphery. And then a bunch of stuff happened and it rose and it rose and it rose and it rose to become the hegemon of the world. First, it got core status in about the 1880s, after the Civil War, after the problem of whether it was going to try to be in the core or stay in the periphery was settled in the United States. Then it kept on rising and won 2 world wars. And the last one in both Europe and Asia. So after that, and after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the US was the global hegemon, both politically and militarily and economically. But its hegemony has been declining since then. And that's one of the big problems right now. Okay, but I'll explain to you what I mean by that. It's both good news from a point of view of a lot of people, but a problem for the whole system and a problem for a lot of people too. Okay. Okay. What I've done, how am I doing on time, Fabio? Are you listening? Can you tell me? That is it. What time did I start? Does anybody know?
Pedro, você sabe que horas que ele começou a falar? Agora é 3h15? I think 45 minutes have you talked?
I've been talking already for 45 minutes.
Yes.
Oh, God. All right, I got to speed this up.
Feel free.
Okay. Huh?
You can talk. Don't
Yeah,
worry.
okay. Well, I want to stop at 60 minutes because I want to have a discussion with people about what I've said. And so far, okay, I'm going to summarize a lot here. What I do, what our research project is it studies stuff quantitatively. The nice thing about that is you can see about changes in scale. And the basic idea about changes in scale that we use is this diagram at the lower part of this slide, okay, which shows various possibilities. Most things that we study, and the main big things that we're studying are quantitatively, are the population sizes of settlements. And settlements are camps, hamlets, villages, towns, cities, and urban agglomerations. And population size is measured by the contiguous built up area and then how many people were living in that. Camps are small, cities and urban agglomerations are large. So basically it went up, but it didn't just go up. We study the largest settlement in each world system to see what the trends are. And what we see are cycles as well as a long-term upward trend. And the same for the territorial sizes of the largest polities, bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states, empires, and modern hegemons. Basically, the long-term trend is go up, but it doesn't just go up. So one of the things we're interested in is when it doesn't go up and when it collapses, because these are quantitative things and we can see by actually measuring them when they go up and when they collapse. Now, we're most interested in talking about disasters in the collapses, but I have some really interesting findings that I will mention. And this research is the source of those things. So this top thing is just a faked up picture of what happens, okay, in political evolution. You have small scale polities over here. Then you have the emergence of states about 5,000 years ago. And then you have the emergence of empires. And then you have the emergence of hegemons with colonial empires and then hegemons without former colonies. That would be the United States. And then I'm predicting global state formation. But I think about the future the same way I think about the past. I'm not talking about next year. I'm talking about the next 100 years, at least, okay? And I think if the humans survive the mess we're in right now, a global state will emerge. I'll talk more about that later. The bottom graph is actual quantitative measurements of the largest polities in each system in terms of square megameters. And this I can't remember whether this is logged or not. Let's see if it says no. Okay. Basically, here's the Akkadian Empire, which emerged in Mesopotamia about 4,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. It wasn't very big. Then you had not much going on. And then the rise of the Neo-Assyrian, the Persian, and Alexander's empire. And then the rise of Rome, which wasn't at its biggest, as big as some of these guys had been. Then you had the Islamic empires, then the Mongol Empire, which was weird because it was a peripheral marcher state, as we say. And then the British Empire, which is counting all the sizes of the British colonies. This is squared megameters of territory of control, okay? So this basically shows the trend I was talking about, and it also shows the bumps. It's a bumpy trend. This is the same thing except using urban sizes. The largest cities in each of these areas are actually looking at all the systems, all the world systems since Mesopotamia. But this is a log scale, okay? So Europe, remember this is a logarithmic scale. So Europe was big, was the first big city and the first probably real state on Earth. And then a bunch of bouncing around, Babylon, Thebes, Babylon again, Rome was big, Constantinople was big, Baghdad, Cairo, London, New York, Tokyo, okay? So New York was the biggest city in the world until it was surpassed by Tokyo recently. So these waves, what we're interested in is when it goes down. That's when collapse is occurring. And I'm comparing both the urban up sweeps and down sweeps to the territorial sizes of polys, up sweeps and down sweeps. This is a diagram that shows both the largest and the second largest cities and the largest and the second largest empires in the central system. The central system is that system that engulfed all the other systems. It's the one we live in now. We just call it the modern world system. But I'm going back to the Bronze Age. So back here, it's Mesopotamia. That's the one we start with, because it's why are we doing these areas and not say the Americas? It's because we have data. We have quantitative data. And this is showing the relationship between the largest and the second largest polity and city in each system. Now, we're not studying individual cities. We're studying the largest city in the system. And what you see, a number of interesting things you see. In most systems, when a large city declines, another large city somewhere else emerges near, not too far away. And the same with polities, okay? So we ignore that and just study the largest. That's what usually happens, but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes a big one collapses and all the other ones collapse too. And the interesting thing here, this is a correlation or a city that shows partial correlations controlling for time to take out the long-term trend, is that the largest and second largest cities are highly correlated with one another. This means there are waves of city growth and waves of city decline. So if you're studying change over time, it's not a zero-sum game. When one city emerges, other cities don't automatically decline. There's periods of growth in systems, and the same with empires, not as big. But where is it? That's here. All right, I got to keep moving. Now, there's another idea that I introduce, and it's a little bit of a controversial thing in the world system perspective, but I see it over and over again and can't ignore it. There's something that Leon Trotsky called uneven and combined development. And the new systems that emerge and that expand, the upsweeps, are often produced by conquest, by what we call a non-core marcher state. A marcher state is a new state out on the edge of a system that conquers the old core and makes a big new empire. When we try to find out how many of the big upsweeps were territorial size upsweeps were done by this conquest by marcher states, it's more than half. So this doesn't explain everything. There are also internal processes within polities that lead to upsweeps, but this marcher state phenomenon is widespread, okay? And these are examples of empires you may have heard of, or in this case, Hawaii, in which some power from the backside of the island that nobody ever heard of first conquers the whole island and then conquers all the islands. This was King Kamehameha in Hawaii, okay? The rest of these are also like that. The Neo-Assyrian Empire happened after a group conquered the old Assyrian city-state and then carried out this huge, big expansion. The Persian Empire, the Achaemenids were basically horse pastoralists and small-scale agriculturalists from Central Asia. Macedonia, that's Alexander. His dad, Philip, started the process. They're from Macedonia, which is this little place where they raised goats, okay? It was the periphery of the Greek system, but they conquered a huge chunk of the world. The Romans were Latins living as small farmers on hills near the these city-states that were already in the Italian peninsula. And they decided they want to have a city too. So they started organizing the Latins and conquered all the Etruscan cities. And then they conquered what looked like their known world. The unusual thing about the Roman Empire was how long it lasted, because most empires don't last that long. They rise and they fall. The Roman Empire lasted for a very long time because they kept reinventing themselves and figuring out how to deal with their problems and keeping it going. The Qin was the first unification of China. Okay, it was a small state out on the edge on the western side in which there was a king that reorganized the army and rolled up the system. The Yuan, that was the Mongol Empire after it conquered China. Abbasid is the Islamic empires, which were really big. The Khmer was in Cambodia. It was a big empire that started out on the edge of the Indo-China system and then rose and took over everything. The Inca were way up in the hills, a bunch of small farmers who built a polity up and then rolled up the system following earlier empires that had been in the same area. The Aztecs were Chichimecs. There were people who were migrated into the Valley of Mexico, managed to get permission to live on an island in a lake, and then made alliances, reinvented themselves, created a ruling class because they had formerly been very egalitarian, claimed to be descended from the Toltec Empire, even though they just made that up, and then conquered the whole place. And I already mentioned Kamehameha. All right. So if you look at these empires, I study empires, if you look at them to figure out where they came from, more than half of them were conquests by non-core marcher states. I say non-core rather than semi-peripheral. Most of them were semi-peripheral. Some of them were not semi-peripheral, like the Mongols, like the Xiongnu, like Central Asian steppe nomads sometimes formed these big confederations in order to extract tribute from China, but sometimes when they can't make that work, they start conquering China, and that's what happened with the Mongols. Okay, this is uneven development. Right? It's a process that operates over and over in which the old cores get stuck in their ways and can't reinvent themselves fast enough to deal with what's happening, and you have these new guys emerge from out of the end. Ibn Khaldun's theory about the rise and fall of Islamic states is one of the theories. I'm not talking about theories here. I'm just telling you what happened. The other weird thing from the point of view of trying to understand what was going on with capitalism, with commodified exchange and with the development of money and all this stuff and the use of money, was the emergence of the long rise of capitalism since the Bronze Age. We normally think of capitalism, or most people think of something that happened with industrialization. But if capitalism is a ruling class primarily getting their wealth and power from profit making, this was already going on in the Bronze Age. There were states in the Bronze Age. The first one we know about, and we don't know much about it, is called Dilmun. It was in between the Mesopotamian and the Indus River Valley empires, the Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro in South Asia. And they were a carrying trade. They were maritime. They did boats, and they were basically run by people who were carrying on that trade. And then they sort of got wiped out because of these empires that were expanding. The old Assyrian city-state was Ashur. It was not a maritime thing. Most of these early capital city-states are using ships and water transportation because it's cheaper, and they care about costs because they're doing trade. But the old Assyrian city-state was donkey caravans. They had cornered the market on tin, and they had a big chunk of the market on copper. If you have tin on copper, guess what you can make? Bronze, which was the key commodity in the Bronze Age. And they emerged in this big network starting up the Tigris River and were around for a long time. Then Ashur got conquered by these other people, and that's when the Neo-Assyrian city-state. So there's niche switching going on here. This niche of in between the big empires, you can run a city-state that's doing trade and living on trade. But the other thing is, it's not merchant capitalism in the Marxist sense. They're also producing commodities as well as finding raw materials and stuff to exchange. And especially that's the case for the Phoenician city-states. They concentrate certain kinds of production that are key commodities in their whole big network. The other thing is evolutionary significance of these guys is they're spreading economic networks, markets, by showing up every year and asking people, isn't there something you'd like to trade with us because we got all this cool stuff? But they're also developing technologies, communications technologies, and accounting technologies that spread widely and make a market-based production for exchange economy easier for people. And then that Hansa and the Italian city-states are important in the rise of European capitalism. Okay, you got these two chunks of city-states in Europe, and the modern nation states emerge out of them, modern capitalist states. All right. So there's a lot going on here where this is the new thing that I'm doing is studying disasters and first trying to figure out theories of disasters and then figure out how they work with regard to these sequences of upsweeps and collapses. And I don't really know for sure because it's hard to do research on quantitative research on disasters. The other thing I do is I define disasters very broadly as both natural and anthropogenic and include warfare. Now, most people don't, when they think of disasters, of natural disasters, they know warfare is anthropogenic. Well, everything's not everything, but most things are anthropogenic now. What I'm doing is extending that back into the past and saying, wait a minute, big wars are like disasters. And also pandemics are disasters, and they've been going on for a long time. I'm interested in selection effects, but selection occurs at multiple levels in the system. Individuals, some survive, some don't. That's selection. Households, same. Settlements, yes. Polys, okay. So really what's going on is a set of multi-level things in which smaller things are nested within larger things. I'm interested in the relationship between disasters and world revolutions, but I've just started thinking about that and I don't really know what's going on. All right. Carl Butzer, we're going to ignore him. This is a cool model by an archaeologist named Carl Butzer that a lot of theories of disasters ignore the problem of their effects on evolution, but Butzer doesn't do that. He talks about how things survive. Some things don't survive, they collapse. Other things figure out how to deal with it, and there's selection going on here. So this is Butzer's model. It's really nice. Okay, so what's going to happen? What's going on now? Well, there have been times of troubles all along. The times of troubles phrase is from Arnold Toynbee, who studied civilizations and their developments and did that comparatively. And it's just a general term that means when things are falling apart and polys are getting smaller and states are collapsing and the economy is going to hell and stuff like that. These upsweeps and downsweeps and periods of collapse are showing that times of troubles aren't new. We also remember the 20th century, or at least we heard about it, many of us, okay? I was born in 1944. The worst was over by the time I came along, except for Hiroshima, okay, and Nagasaki. The first half of the 20th century was a mess. It was 2 world wars and a global revolt led by communists and socialists, the Russian Revolution and the World Revolution of 1917, okay? So there was a lot of, it was similar, but also different from what's going on now. So here's what I want to say about what's happening now, okay? As I mentioned before, US hegemony has been declining for a long time. First, being the economic center of the world in the sense of production, went by the boards already in the 1970s when Germany and Japan finally caught up with the United States after having been decimated in World War II. What that led to was overcapacity and lower prices in the profits returning to manufacturers. And what happened was something that both Emmanuel Walsh and Giovanni Arrighi had already talked about, which was the emergence of finance capital in the hegemon. So the hegemon gets its centrality in the world system by being in stages. First, by producing consumer goods that everybody needs and at a lower price, then by producing capital goods that everybody needs but at a lower price, and then moving on to finance capital, which uses the institutional centrality built up in the first two stages to create a global financial system that benefits the hegemon. That is what happened with the United States, and that's the world we're sort of still living in. The problem with financial capitalism is it's based on trust and a bunch of stuff that's very weird, which involves people recognizing the legitimacy of the hegemon. Hegemony is both coercion and consent. Consent is very important, especially if you don't have an empire. And the US is the first hegemon that never had its own colonial empire. In fact, it was created out of the process of decolonization that I already talked about, okay? So this gives the US a certain amount of legitimacy with the other countries that it was the first new nation that declared itself independent of European colonialism and then allied with the decolonizations that were occurring in Latin America for the most part, not all of them, and then created a world empire that is not an empire based on military predominance, but not direct political control over an empire. The way that works is what we call clientelism, but also the deal was after World War II, the US will support your decolonization from France, Belgium, Britain, etc., if you let us put a military base in your country. That's how we end up with 782 US military bases all over the world. Now, we don't call that an empire, but it kind of is. Okay, it's a military empire. The problem with this global military empire by the United States is it's very expensive. So you have to pay for it. That's where dependence on finance capital comes in, because it allows the federal government to tax a bunch of things and support this huge, big, bloated military expenditure and maintain this empire that is not a formal empire. Now we have the decline of US hegemony that's been going on mainly because of changes that have occurred within the United States, but also because of the rise of challengers. Okay, so we have a bunch of countries from the semi-periphery that are challenging the global power of the United States. That's already happening. The BRICS, the coalition, and a bunch of other countries that are sympathetic with that. Imperialism, neo-imperialism, neocolonialism, neoliberal imperialism, whatever you want to call it, always creates a reaction to itself. You need ideology and some kind of universalistic ideology to legitimate the centrality of global power. The United States had that, and it was capitalism and democracy, okay, the free world. The problem with that is it doesn't really add up at the global level, because especially when you're talking about military power, because the US military is controlled allegedly by the President of the United States, but the President of the United States is not elected by the people of the world. It's elected by people in the United States. So there's a little bit of a mismatch there, which is increasingly problematic when you have challenges to all kinds of authority and all this kind of stuff, which is what's going on now. There are big crises, and US hegemony is continuing to decline, which is fine from the point of view of people who have been suffering from US imperialism for a long time. They're pretty happy about this, okay? But there's a problem. it's the run up to World War I problem. Okay, as multipolarity in military power increases, you have the possibility of world war among powerful states. We really haven't had that kind of war since World War II. Okay, we've had proxy wars, lots of them, but we haven't had world wars, wars among the great powers, as the political scientists call them. So that's the danger of hegemonic decline. Okay, what's needed, and I'll talk about this a bit more, is some kind of UN with real capability rather than just a debating society, some kind of world authority that can outlaw warfare and enforce the law. The UN is not up to that, and there's a lot of problems, but there's a big push right now for reforming the UN, which I'll talk about in a bit. How am I doing on time?
I think you can close in your speech.
All right, yeah. Okay. When I make predictions, I'm going to talk about 3 possible futures, and we can discuss this more because I'm going to go over it quickly. One possibility is that this is not the end of capitalism, as Emmanuel Wallerstein and a whole bunch of other people said. It's really another sort of Giovanni Arrighi transition to another kind of capitalism, another what he called systemic cycle of capitalist accumulation. And my bet on that is, because there's many possibilities, is a zero carbon state and a transnational green financial capitalism, basically the global Green New Deal. Now keep this in mind, because in the end, I'm going to end up supporting the global Green New Deal, influenced by Noam Chomsky and Robert Pollin and all these other people, which is basically saying we're not getting rid of capitalism this time. That if you want to get rid of capitalism, it's not going to be in this current time of trouble. The time of troubles I'm talking about is the next. I think I got another slide here. Oh, it's the next 20 to 40 years. I'm not quite sure when, but there's going to be a mess for the next 20 or 30 or 40 years, similar to earlier transition periods. But one outcome of that, after the mess is over, would be another systemic cycle of capitalist accumulation. The reason to suppose this, as Arrighi's intimated, is capitalism is a pretty flexible system, okay? And you already see elements of this in it right now. There are big capitalist firms who are totally going with the zero carbon thing, including Cummins. That's basically they produce diesel engines. They're stopping haven't stopped production of diesel engines yet, but they're starting to produce electric engines that can do all the things their diesel engines can to do. So they're going for zero carbon. And the bet here is that in context of transnational green financial capitalism becomes the global Green New Deal, which, like the earlier New Deal, allows capitalism to adjust to its own contradictions and to continue, but in a different way, okay? The second possibility in the following the next 20 or 30 years, but maybe earlier, is a global police state. A lot of people, leftists like me, are thinking, looking at what's going on, they're thinking this could happen. There's the rise of these neo-fascist movements all over the place, the rise of neo-fascist regimes that could morph, and technologies that allow for a surveillance security state, and this could morph into a global police state. And I think that is a real possibility. The third possibility is a lot nicer. It's what I call a democratic and collectively rational global political economy. Okay, that's the one I'm in favor of, and probably organized around eco-socialism. But I'm wondering, my problem is, I don't know if we really have time to do that, but whether we do or not, we should already be laying down the tracks for this, because if it doesn't happen in this round, it could happen in a later round. Okay, so this is the Chomsky stuff. Noam Chomsky, I suppose you all know who he is. He's an anarchist who's been a huge critic of American imperialism and is basically a revolutionary. But he and this guy, Robert Pollin, wrote a book Now, the book was written during the time of COVID and the time in which Donald Trump was the president of the United States. It was published in 2020. Okay, so take that into account when you're thinking about what he says. But basically what he says, I think, is right. That the coming situation is so dire with regard to the consequences of climate change and global warming and extreme heat and all these other things that are going to happen in this immediate period, that we can't spend all that much energy trying to revolutionize the world system, that we need to just get behind the global Green New Deal, which isn't a change in the mode of production, the mode of accumulation. It's just a change that could help us survive in this period that's extremely threatening. Now, I've tried to find out if Chomsky has changed his opinion, but I haven't, since he wrote this book in 2020, but I haven't been able to figure it out. I don't think so. The main point is you need to use the existing institutions to change the behavior of the world economy and the world polity, because there isn't time to revolutionize them in order to prevent a disaster that will be beyond belief from the point of view of people who think that the humans should survive. That you need to just use the institutions that exist pretty much. Now, the other thing I do is I present here some problems with this. One of them is that replacing fossil fuels and doing the zero carbon thing still requires a massive increase in extractivism in mining primarily, which then itself has huge negative effects. So what you may do is stop increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and slow down global warming, which is good, but you're also going to destroy a huge chunk of the environment, depending on how the mining is done. There are different ways to do it. So the issue becomes how to do the expand or change the way in which extraction works so that it works better for people and doesn't destroy the environment so much. Prefiguration is the idea of laying down the institutional tracks and the cultural tracks for a world in the future that you want to come to exist. And the point I would make here is you can do this in the context of the global Green New Deal. You just can't put all your energy in that. But you can be cognizant of it. And of course, Chomsky and Pollan, this is what they suggest. But their main point is, hey, don't be too utopian here. Be pragmatic. Okay, we've got to do something right now, or else our species is kind of cooked. What I then have a couple of slides where I suggest interesting things that should be done at various levels. Local community cooperation, degrowth co-ops. There's a paper on Wednesday by Leslie Sclair about that. Permaculture is basically sustainable horticulture. It's gardening in a way that doesn't destroy the soil and the surrounding nature and all that. Then there's how would these local co-ops and small farmer, organic farmer types interact with each other. And there's a guy named Abdullah Öcalan who has an idea about how that could work, that he calls democratic collectivism or something like that. At the national level, we can't get rid of large scale agriculture because we're going to have 10 or 12 billion people to feed, and permaculture gardens is not going to be able to do it. So the real thing that needs to be done is to reform large scale agriculture so it's not so destructive for the environment. And we must do this. We can't just get rid of large scale agriculture. It won't work. People will just starve to death. Peace age foreign policies, shrinking the military industrial complex and reducing its political influence. Okay, one problem with the politics of the modern world is there are entrenched powers, both fossil fuel companies and the military industrial complex, the people who make money on selling weapons. And both of these groups are a disaster. And we need to figure out ways to undercut their power and push them back into a corner. A lot of people are already working on this. We can also develop democratic economic and resource planning. There's a bunch of cool proposals about how to do that, from the idea of sort of cooperative economy and so on, and in the context of what people have called eco-socialism. All right. Transnational social movements. I study the Global Justice Network. I've done a lot of research on the World Social Forum. What I see is the likelihood that the network of movements, which is sort of all over the place, can converge around the climate justice theme. And that does seem to be happening. Extinction Rebellion, I think most of you have heard about that. That's young people who are actually using direct action to try to deal with the problem about how industrial capitalism is wiping out, doing another mass extinction event. So fair mining, okay, is the key term here. There's a lot of people thinking about how nations can restructure the extractive economy so that it's fairer and takes into account. The reason why nations have to do this is because they have sovereignty over natural resources, forests and minerals and stuff like that. So there's a lot of interesting stuff about how to organize extraction so that it's fair. We can't end extraction because people do need and will need, at least 10 or 12 billion people, to have things made out of metal and things made out of plastic and stuff like that. We can't end extraction, just end it. Although we can oppose and obstruct existing extraction operations as a tactic for reorganizing the whole organization of extraction and turning it into a more just type of operation. And I propose building a party network, a global party network, that transnational movements can, these other goals can be coordinated by the establishment of a global party network. There are already things like this. So this may involve a set of alliances among existing institutions or something new. I don't know. Whatever will work would be fine with me. And then at the global level, ideas about the planetary commons and all this stuff, which is a big literature. Outlawing warfare and enforcing the law. I already mentioned that. The World Trade Organization is basically trying to set up global free trade in commodities, which wipes out a whole bunch of small farmers and needs to be either abolished or reformed. World federalism is the establishment of an expansion of global citizenship and personhood. So the whole system of national citizenship is kind of a disaster, but this is an idea of that comes from the literature about the emergence of a global federal and democratic state. And reforming the UN, I already mentioned this slightly, but here's a bunch of lists about the things that the UN should do, or that, and if not the UN, the problem is the UN is very hard to reform because its own rules, the existing charter, put a lot of roadblocks in the way. So it's not clear how this is going to happen, but it's a big issue right now within the UN and in the larger community of people who care about the UN. And my colleague, Pat Manning. Okay, then I've got a bunch of slides that are basically references for the above. And then here are my big takeaways. Think like a star, a mountain, a microbe, an archaeologist, a world sociologist, and a futurist, and a pragmatic revolutionary, and organize locally, regionally, nationally, transnationally, globally. Okay, get on this. Collapses have always been followed by recovery so far. Now, this presumes that the human species does have the capability of completely wiping out all the humans right now. But my thought is, even if there's another world war, that it probably won't kill everybody. So the survivors will survive and get along, and then the whole process of socio-cultural evolution will start again. And the question is, how long will it take till they kind of get back to the same place we are, which is that we have big polis, big powerful polis. They're destroying the biosphere and stuff like that, and have the capability of wiping each other out. So will they learn and do something else? Who knows? The next decades are going to be hard, but we need to support both the global Green New Deal and the national Green New Deals. There's one in Brazil, and lay down the tracks for a more democratic, egalitarian, and collectively rational future society. And we can do both of these things. They're not the same thing, but that doesn't prevent us from doing both. The other idea is, even if we get a global police state, that won't be the end of history, because empires rise and fall. Okay? And so will that global police state. So there will be future opportunities to get it right, even if we have to go through a very nasty period in which technologies are controlled by the people who have the most power, and everybody else sort of has to play like they're going along with it. All right, that's it, folks. What time is it? Not too bad. I'm going to stop sharing my screen unless somebody wants to go back to one of these slides.
So after this wonderful conference with so many ideas and so many suggestions, as Christopher did at the end, he showed us activist program. So not only he made analysis, but at the end he suggested political actions. And we have only 10 minutes now to make some comments or questions for Chris.
So, Chris, question is, Andrei Karataev. You said, yes, yes, so this way. Yes, I see. You mentioned that decolonization goes in waves. Does it mean that we should expect a new wave of colonization? So there was a wave of decolonization a few decades ago. So do you expect a new wave of colonization? Or perhaps, or just as a comment, I think you have a great problem. You expect that all the trends which went for hundreds of years will continue, the patterns will continue. Because, no, I do not expect a new wave of colonization. And because, you know, you also expect a sort of global, the world state. Because there was a trend towards just states becoming larger, larger, and larger. And so if we continue this trend, we will have world state in a few decades or in a few centuries. But the problem is that in recent decades, we have trends reversals. But you had trends which continued for millions of years, for centuries, for millennia, for million years, for billions of years. But now the trends are reversed. For example, the world population was growing just continuously. There was continuous increase in the world population and acceleration of the world population. But since the early 1970s, you have the trend reversal. You have the same with the economy. Do not you expect? No, should not you take into account that the trend extrapolation does not work now, that you should take into account the trend reversal? The trend reversal. So if before or the decolonization periods were followed by colonization, it does not mean that we should expect a new wave of colonization ahead. Yes.
Chris, we will have some questions and you answer at the end, right?
Okay.
Here is Professor Regina Rodriguez from Climate, Professor of Climate and Physical Oceanography here in university. My question is, I like obviously your suggestions. I'm pro the degrowth. Actually, I don't believe in a Green New Deal as well. But your last suggestion, in my opinion, is to looking at the perspective of mankind. And I think as a climate scientist, I see that we are reaching planetary boundary limits. And I'm not too sure if we have the time to go through what you just said of a going down and up again because of the environment. In my opinion, we are already in a limit. We cannot afford a police state to then go down and up again for then democracy and more social, which is what I want to, but I don't think we have this time anymore because this is different. This is we are reaching the limits of the planetary boundaries from the perspective of a climate and the physical system, in my opinion, and biodiversity.
Chris, can you answer, please?
Sure. So Andrei Korotev says, have I considered trend reversal issues regarding population, and is it possible there would be another wave of colonialism? The other wave of colonialism is an interesting idea because of what I showed about the long history of waves of colonialism. Here's what I would suggest, though. I think that the institutionalization of the ideology of national sovereignty is pretty deep. That has been the outcome of the rise of American hegemony and these long waves of decolonization. So, but that doesn't mean there couldn't be other things that are like colonialism, and there already are. We call it neo-colonialism. I mean, foreign investment is not called colonialism, but there's lots of that. And so we know that countries can become dependent on foreign investment, and it's part of the global hierarchy that already exists. So that hasn't gone away at all. It's still living, and so there certainly could be more of that. And I would just call it, I wouldn't call it colonialism. I would call it neo-colonialism or something. Okay. The global power structure didn't go away because of decolonization. It just got reorganized as other forms of exploitation and domination. And those things certainly could either be ended somehow or continued or even expanded. And we see a lot of the things going on now that look like they are attempts at formal colonialism, wars over territory, and so on. So I don't mean to suggest that things like that are impossible in the future, okay? The idea of the reversal of population growth, that's a very important thing. It's a so-called demographic revolution, and I know that Andrei Korotev has written a lot about this. The point that I would make is that whole process is extremely important, but it hasn't really happened yet completely in the whole world. There are still 8 countries whose population is rapidly increasing. And so we're going to end up with 10 or 12 million people eventually. And so we're not done with population pressure, one. population pressure is still a huge factor in the evolution of the world system. And it's likely to get worse because of global warming, because of sea level rise, and because of extreme heat making huge areas unlivable. There's going to be mass migrations and all this stuff, people leaving places that you can no longer live. So that's a form of population pressure. Population pressure has been an important driver of evolution all along. And I don't see it ending anytime soon. Okay. That isn't, it's obviously the case that eventually it could end if we stabilize the human population and have ways of regulating access to resources that are fair. Then you could pretty much get rid of population pressure as a driver, but it would still be always in the background, because whatever institutions you have would be vulnerable to disintegration and so on. Now that leads me to the other question by Regina Rodriguez, and actually it's related to what I just said. She's talking about planetary boundaries, and I think she has in mind a bunch of things about peak resources and fresh water and all these things. The reason why I'm able to think about a future beyond the current environmental crisis is sort of what I said, same thing about warfare, which is it probably won't kill everybody. If you understand Malthusian crises that have already occurred, basically warfare and diseases and so on kill off a lot of people, which lowers population pressure, doesn't it? Yeah. If you destroy half of the human population, then you only got 6 billion instead of 12 billion. And so for a while, population pressure is less. And so the biosphere recovers because humans aren't exploiting it as much because there's fewer of them. So that's one way in which there is a human future, even if the current thing is really bad. Now, none of us want half of the human species to get wiped out, but that could happen if things go really bad in this current crisis, all right? I don't think it necessarily means the end of human existence, though, for both what I said about warfare and what I would say about the resource problems. Okay. Our species, you know what the big feature of our species is? We're flexible. Not everybody, but people are, especially when it comes to survival. And I think that that means that there will be places on Earth where people will be able to survive. And then they'll start doing what they have done in the past again. Now, it won't be the same because they'll have a memory of what happened. But those memories usually last only so long. And my thought is the forces that drive what has happened, it would be a different world, but it would also be somewhat similar. By the way, let me just mention this. This is a scary idea. I did mention the failure of the SETI, the search for extraterrestrial life, to find anything in the way of smart communication coming from distant stars. One hypothesis that I learned from the graduate student that I know is that the reason that is because they all destroyed themselves at the same point that we are at now. Isn't that lovely?
Now we have to end this session because we have now a coffee break, and right after we can begin the next panel, hazards, disasters, and Brazilian responses, global pandemics, and disaster justice. And we are now in 15, 20 minutes, we come back because we don't have to be late. We cannot be late because people around the world waiting for us, okay?